The chaos arrived on a Tuesday night, smelling of iron and expensive cologne. Alara was charting vitals when the emergency bay doors burst open, slammed back against their stops by two men in dark suits. Between them, a third man was a ruin of tailored silk and blood. His head was down, dark hair plastered to his forehead with sweat, but it was the stillness in his shoulders that caught her attention. It was the posture of a predator, even when wounded. Doctors and nurses swarmed, a flurry of blue scrubs and urgent questions that were met with stony silence from the two guards and a low, guttural sound from the injured man. Alara moved toward the controlled pandemonium, her movements economical, her mind already triaging. Gunshot wounds, at least two. Possible collapsed lung. "We need to get him on a gurney now," Dr. Evans shouted, trying to get a hand on the man's arm. The reaction was immediate and violent. The injured man surged upward, shoving the doctor back with shocking strength. He was on his feet, unsteady but lethal, his eyes scanning the room. They were dark, fiercely intelligent, and utterly disoriented. He backed away, ignoring the blood blooming on his white shirt, his body tense to either fight or flee. His guards moved to flank him, their hands inside their jackets. The air in the ER crackled, thick with the threat of imminent violence. "Sir, you're in a hospital. We need to help you," a senior nurse said, her voice loud and slow, as if speaking to someone who didn't understand the language. He didn't even look at her. His gaze swept past the faces, the frantic gestures, the shouting. He saw their mouths moving, but the sounds were lost to him. The world was a silent, threatening pantomime. He was cornered, deaf to their intentions, and every instinct screamed trap. He took another step back, hitting the wall. That was it. He was ready to fight his way out. Alara saw it. Not just the panic, but the profound isolation in his eyes. He wasn't defiant. He was deaf. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. All the noise, the shouting, the commands, it was just static to him. A threat he couldn't interpret. While others saw a monster, she saw a man drowning in silence. Ignoring the tense standoff, she turned, her sneakers squeaking on the linoleum. She grabbed a small whiteboard and a marker from the nurse's station. Her colleagues stared, a few murmuring in confusion, but she ignored them. She wrote 4 words in clear, block letters. She walked back toward him, holding the board up. She didn't try to get too close, just near enough for him to read it. She held his gaze, her own steady and calm. His eyes, sharp as obsidian chips, dropped from her face to the board. "You are safe now." For a long moment, nothing happened. The air was a held breath. Then, the tension in his shoulders eased by a fraction. A flicker of something other than raw fury crossed his face. He looked from the board back to her, a question in his eyes. Alara nodded once, a small, certain gesture. She kept her expression neutral, professional. She was a nurse. This was her patient. The fact that his suit probably cost more than her car was irrelevant. The fact that his guards looked like they killed people for a living was a problem for later. He watched her, his focus absolute. He was still a coiled spring, but he was listening with his eyes. Alara took a slow step forward. She pointed to herself, then mouthed the word, "Nurse." She then pointed to the empty gurney. His gaze followed her gesture. He was still wary, his body a testament to a life of violence, but the wild, cornered look was gone. It was replaced by a cold, assessing intelligence. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod to his men. They relaxed, but only just. He finally looked back at Alara, and with a deliberateness that sent a chill down her spine, he walked to the gurney and sat down. He never took his eyes off her. The entire emergency room seemed to exhale at once. Dr. Evans rushed forward again, but one of the guards put a firm hand on his chest. "She handles it," the man said, his voice a low rumble. He wasn't asking. And just like that, Alara's world tilted on its axis. She was no longer just a nurse on the night shift. She was the only thing standing between the most dangerous man she had ever seen and a bloodbath in the middle of her hospital. She had become his interpreter, his anchor in a silent, threatening world. What she didn't know yet was that she had also just become his possession. The hospital administration folded in under an hour. A private wing, previously closed for renovations, was suddenly opened. Security guards who were not on the hospital's payroll materialized in the hallways, their presence as quiet and absolute as stone. Kwon Jin-woo, as she learned his name was a man who did not ask for things. He reshaped reality to his will. Alara was now his private nurse. It wasn't a request. Her supervisor had explained it to her with a pale face and trembling hands, offering triple her salary and an indefinite leave of absence from her regular duties. It was an offer she couldn't refuse because the alternative was unthinkable. Jin-woo's room was less a hospital room and more a command center. Laptops hummed on a table, and his two primary guards, whom she learned were named Min-jun and Seo-jun, stood sentinel by the door. Jin-woo himself was in the bed, stripped of his ruined suit and now in a simple black t-shirt and pants. The doctors had done their work, but he had refused any sedation, his control absolute even in pain. He watched her every move as she checked his foredrip. The silence in the room was heavier than the chaos of the ER had been. It was a weighted, tactical silence. She communicated with him through the whiteboard and, to her own surprise, a rusty, half-remembered version of the sign language she'd learned in a college elective. His responses were curt, written on a tablet he kept by his side. "Pain?" she signed, her movements hesitant. He watched her hands, his expression unreadable. He picked up his tablet and typed, "Tolerable." She nodded, making a note on his chart. She was all business, all professionalism. It was the only armor she had. She refused to think about the dragon tattoo that coiled around his neck, the tail of it disappearing beneath the collar of his shirt. She refused to think about the network of fine, silvery scars that mapped his knuckles. That night, she saw the crack in his armor. She had been sitting in the chair in the corner of the room, ostensibly reading a medical journal but really just trying to stay awake, when a sound from the bed drew her attention. It was a sharp, choked gasp. Jin-woo was sitting bolt upright, his eyes wide with a terror that was stark and primal. His hands were clenched in the sheets. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving. He wasn't seeing the hospital room. He was somewhere else, trapped in a memory. His gaze was unfocused, darting around as if searching for a threat he couldn't see or hear. This was more than a nightmare. It was a trauma response. The vulnerability she'd seen in the ER was back, magnified and raw. Without thinking, Alara was on her feet. She didn't touch him. She knew better. Instead, she moved into his line of sight and switched on the small bedside lamp, making sure the light wasn't too jarring. She held up her hands, palms open, a gesture of peace. She waited until his frantic eyes finally focused on her. "You are here," she signed slowly. "You are safe." He stared at her, his breathing still ragged. The terror slowly receded, replaced by a deep, hollow shame. He, Kwon Jin-woo, did not feel terror. He did not lose control. He looked away, turning his face to the window, presenting her with a profile carved from granite. He typed on his tablet without looking at her, his thumb moving with precision. He held it out. "Leave." But she didn't. She saw the tremor in his hand, the one he couldn't conceal. She knew what it was like to feel utterly alone, to be trapped in your own head. She walked over to the table and poured a glass of water, setting it on his bedside table. She didn't look at him. "I'll be right outside if you need anything," she said softly, knowing he couldn't hear the words but hoping he would understand the sentiment. Then she turned and walked out, closing the door quietly behind her. She leaned against the cool wall of the corridor, her own heart beating a little too fast. She had seen something she wasn't supposed to see. The man who controlled a slice of Seoul's underworld was haunted by his own silence. It wasn't just a physical condition. It was his deepest wound, the one thing in his life he could not command or conquer. A few days later, the hospital was no longer safe. Min-jun approached her, his face grim. "We are moving him," he said. "The men who did this know he is here." Alara's blood ran cold. She had been living in a strange bubble, a world of silent communication and unspoken threats contained within the hospital walls. Now that bubble was about to burst. "What does that have to do with me?" she asked, her voice steady despite the flutter of fear in her stomach. "He will not go without you," Minjun stated simply. It wasn't a compliment. It was a fact. You will be compensated. You will be protected. It was a choice that was not a choice. To stay behind now, knowing what she knew, was a death sentence. They would see her as a loose end. To go with them was to step willingly into the fire. She thought of his eyes in the dark, filled with a terror he would never admit. She thought of the slight tremor in his hand. She was a nurse. Her job was to preserve life. And for some reason, her staying felt like it was essential to preserving his. "I'll get my things," she said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil inside her. It was a deliberate choice. A step off a cliff she couldn't see the bottom of. The transfer was a masterclass in silent, brutal efficiency. They moved through service corridors and underground parking garages, a small, heavily armed convoy in a series of black sedans with tinted windows. Alara was in the same car as Jinwoo. The space was tight, filled with the scent of leather, his cologne, something clean and sharp like cedar, and the low hum of the engine. The city lights of Seoul blurred past the windows. At a red light, a group of laughing friends crossed the street, oblivious to the lethal cargo in the car beside them. For a moment, Alara felt a pang of longing for that simple, uncomplicated world she had lost. Suddenly, the car swerved violently. Another sedan slammed into their side, the screech of metal on metal a deafening shriek. Alara was thrown against Jinwoo. His arm came around her instantly, a band of steel pulling her against his chest, shielding her with his own body. The world outside became a flurry of motion and muffled shouts. Their driver expertly navigated the assault, tires smoking as he pulled them out of the immediate danger. Pressed against him, Alara could feel the hard, controlled beat of his heart against her cheek. His body was tense, ready for violence, but his hold on her was purely protective. Her face was tucked into the curve of his neck. She was surrounded by him. In the middle of an ambush, she should have been terrified. Instead, a strange, unwelcome sense of safety washed over her. The moment was over as quickly as it began. They were clear. The other cars in their convoy had dealt with the threat. But he didn't let her go immediately. He held her for a second too long, his breath warm against her hair. She made the mistake of looking up. His eyes were dark, intense, and fixed on her. The silence in the car was no longer empty. It was charged, electric, filled with everything they couldn't say. He saw her, not as a nurse, not as an employee, but as something else entirely. And she saw the man beneath the monster, the protector beneath the predator. That was the moment everything changed. They arrived at a penthouse that seemed to float above the city, a fortress of glass and steel. The view of Seoul was breathtaking, a glittering tapestry of lights spread out below. But the beauty was cold, sterile. It was a cage, no matter how gilded. Alara found her professional footing again, insisting he rest. The ambush had clearly taken a toll on his still-healing body. While he conferred with his men in his office, communicating through a series of sharp hand gestures and typed messages, she explored the space she was now confined to. She found a library, shelves lined with books in Korean and English. On a small table, there was a framed photograph, turned face down. Curiosity got the better of her. She picked it up. It was a picture of Jinwoo, younger, smiling. His arm was around an older man who looked so much like him they could only be brothers. They both looked happy, unguarded. It was a version of Jinwoo she couldn't reconcile with the cold, dangerous man in the other room. She heard a sound and quickly put the photo back, just as he entered the library. He saw where she had been standing. His eyes flickered to the photograph, and his face became a mask of ice. He walked over, picked it up, and without looking at it, placed it inside a drawer, the sound of it closing final and absolute. He had built a wall of silence around his past as surely as he lived in a world without sound. That night, the war came to them. The attack was brutally efficient. An explosion rocked the floor below, a concussive force that threw Alara to the ground. The emergency lights flickered on, casting the penthouse in an eerie red glow. Alarms blared, but she knew Jinwoo couldn't hear them. He was already moving, emerging from his bedroom with a gun in his hand, his movements fluid and precise. He saw her on the floor, and in 2 strides, he was there, hauling her to her feet. He pushed her behind him, his body a solid shield. His men were already engaging the intruders, the muffled pops of silenced weapons echoing from the main living area. He was focused, his eyes scanning every shadow. He was a creature of violence, born to this world. He pointed, indicating she should stay low and follow him toward the reinforced safety of his office. She did, her heart hammering against her ribs. They were almost there when a man dressed in black dropped from a shattered skylight, landing between them and the door. He held a knife, and his eyes were fixed on Alara. He saw her as the weakness, the leverage. Jinwoo moved to intercept, but another attacker appeared from the hallway, forcing him to divide his attention. For a split second, Alara was alone, exposed. The man with the knife lunged. There was no time to think. Her survival instinct took over. She grabbed a heavy glass sculpture from a pedestal, a swirling abstract piece that probably cost a fortune, and swung it with all her might. It connected with the side of the man's head with a sickening crack. He crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Alara stood over him, breathing heavily, the sculpture still clutched in her hands. Her knuckles were white. She had never hurt another person in her life. A line had been crossed, a line back to her old life, and it had been irrevocably erased. Jinwoo had dealt with his own attacker and was now at her side. He looked from the man on the floor to her, his eyes searching her face. He saw the shock, the horror, but also the flicker of fierce resolve. He reached out, not to the weapon, but to her hand that held it. He gently uncurled her fingers, taking the heavy object from her and setting it aside. His touch was surprisingly gentle. The fight was over moments later. His men were ruthlessly efficient. When the silence descended again, broken only by their ragged breathing, they were alone in the ruined living room. Adrenaline coursed through Alara's veins. Jinwoo led her to a sofa that had somehow survived the chaos and sat her down. He disappeared for a moment and came back with a glass of brandy, pressing it into her trembling hands. He sat across from her, watching her. The silence between them was different now. It was a shared space, forged in violence. He picked up his tablet, his thumb moving across the screen. He held it out for her to read. "I was wrong to bring you here." Alara shook her head, taking a sip of the brandy. The fire of it was a welcome shock. She looked at him, meeting his gaze directly. "I chose to come." She mouthed the words slowly, clearly. He watched her lips, then typed again. "You are not a part of this world. You should not have had to do that." "You saved me in the car," she mouthed back. "Now we're even." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a fleeting, startlingly beautiful thing. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. He became serious again, his gaze intense. He typed one more message, his thumb hesitating for a moment before he finished. "In all the silence, you are the only thing I can hear." The words hit her harder than any bullet. It wasn't a confession of love. It was something deeper, more dangerous. It was an admission of a connection that defied logic. He was the most powerful man she had ever met, a king in a lethal, silent world. And she, a nurse from the night shift, had somehow become his only sound. She knew then that she was no longer his prisoner, or his employee. She was his, and in a way that terrified and thrilled her, he was hers. The rival boss, a man named Park, now knew he couldn't get to Jinwoo through force alone. So he decided to target his foundation. He targeted Alara. The final confrontation was not one of Jinwoo's choosing. He had planned a surgical strike to end Park for good, a plan that involved leaving Alara secured in a secondary, even safer location. She refused. "He knows about me," she argued, using a notepad they now kept for longer conversations. He will come for me whether you are here or not. My only safety is with you." She paused, then added a line that was part logic, part bluff. "And I'm the only one who can tell if you're pushing yourself too far. You're not fully healed." He read her words, his jaw tight. He hated it, but she was right. Park had made her a part of the war. To leave her would be to leave a target undefended. His gaze was heavy, a silent argument he knew he was losing. With a curt nod, he consented. She was in. The plan was to corner Park at a private auction he was attending. Jinwoo's men would secure the perimeter, eliminating Park's guards one by one, creating a path for Jinwoo to face him alone. Alera's role was to stay in the command vehicle, monitoring communications and medical readouts from a discreet biomonitor Jinwoo was wearing. It went wrong almost immediately. Park had anticipated a move. The security was heavier than expected, and a betrayal from within Jinwoo's own ranks meant their entry point was compromised. Jinwoo was cut off from his main force, trapped in the labyrinthine corridors of the auction house with only Minjun at his side. Alera watched the communications go dead, her heart seizing. On the tactical map, Jinwoo's location was a blinking red, surrounded by the enemy. They were walking into an execution. Panic was a cold, useless thing. She pushed it down, her mind racing, her nurse's training kicking in. Assess, diagnose, act. She scanned the building schematics on her screen, her eyes darting over HVAC systems, electrical grids, floor plans. She needed a diversion. Something big. Something no one would expect. Her eyes landed on the fire suppression system. It was a halon gas system, designed to displace oxygen and extinguish a fire without water damage to the priceless art being auctioned. Displacing oxygen. That was it. She bypassed the local controls, her fingers flying across the keyboard of the tactical laptop. She found the manual override. It was a desperate, dangerous move. It wouldn't be lethal, not immediately, but it would cause chaos. It would rob the air of its fuel, making a prolonged firefight impossible. It would force everyone out. She initiated the sequence in the wing where Jinwoo was trapped. She watched the screen, her breath held. Inside, Jinwoo and Minjun were pinned down. The air suddenly grew thin, heavy. A low hiss started, and a thick, colorless gas began to pour from the vents. Their opponents started coughing, their movements becoming sluggish. Jinwoo, recognizing the tactic, knew he had only moments. He looked at Minjun, gave a sharp series of hand signals, and they moved, using the sudden confusion as their cover. It was the opening they needed. He broke through the compromised line, turning the ambush back on its architect. When he finally faced Park in the main gallery, the man was gasping, his face pale. Jinwoo moved through the thinning air like a wraith. The fight was short, brutal, and silent. He was the master of silence. Park never stood a chance. Back in the penthouse, the city lights seemed brighter, the silence softer. The war was over. Jinwoo stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to her. He had been standing there for a long time. Alera knew the cost of his victory. The man who had betrayed him had been a friend for years. The violence was over, but the wounds remained. She walked up behind him, stopping a few feet away. He turned, his face unreadable in the dim light. He had shed the violence of the evening like a second skin, but the weight of his world was still there in his shoulders. He raised his hands. Slowly, deliberately, he signed her name, Alera. Then, he touched his fingers to his chest, right over his heart. It wasn't a question or a statement. It was a fact, an acknowledgement. In his silent world, she was his heartbeat. She was the sound he could feel. Her old life was gone. She could never go back to charting vitals and calming anxious patients. She had crossed into his world and found she was not a visitor. She belonged there. The cost of this new life was her normalcy, her peace. The cost for him was letting someone pass the battlements he had spent a lifetime building. He was no longer just a king on a throne of silence. He was a man with something to lose. He held out his hand, not in a plea, but in an offering. A choice. Her future lay in that hand, a world of danger and devotion, of shadows and a fierce, silent light. She looked at his outstretched hand, then up at his face. She saw her reflection in his dark, steady eyes. And without hesitation, she placed her hand in his. The choice was made, not in words, but in the quiet, unbreakable language they now shared.